I have a really quick question to start us off today. If you had to survive off the food stored in your home at this exact moment, how long do you think you would last? So maybe not as long as people in the past. Today, we're really lucky. We don't fear famine the way we have in centuries past. Our need to put up food for winter or times of scarcity has all but been eliminated thanks to industrialized agriculture, grocery supercenters, and an ever-connected, globalized food economy, which I'm sure you'll touch on at your World's Fair. Food preservation has become more of a craft industry. It's a golden renaissance of small batch pickles, artisanal jerkies, and a seemingly unending supply of kombucha. But for our colonial forebears, keeping food safe was a crucial aspect of everyday life and required a significant amount of time, money, and material resources. A core set of preservation techniques were employed to ensure sustenance in times of need and are a critical part of our shared social and material history. As our food world becomes increasingly prepackaged and artificial, examining the methods and materials of historic preservation provides a fuller picture of the vernacular past and reveals how these techniques still impact many of the foods that we relish today. And their influence goes a lot deeper than we often give it credit for. Dried pasta, for example, is merely a prepackaged extension of thousands of years of dried grain storage. Bacon curing reflects the same smoking and curing methods seen as far back as pre-Roman times, and those Tupperware containers that you have hiding in your fridge still operate on the same principle of excluding air to keep food fresh. But for Britain and colonial America, the increasing sea exploration of the 16th and 17th centuries ushered in a dramatic new wave of preservation efforts and a host of new ingredients and material goods. Exposure to these new cultures and changes in access to particular ingredients naturally shifted the application or development of particular preserving techniques. Across the world, each culture adapted the same foundational approaches of drying, smoking, salting, potting, pickling, and fermenting to their social and environmental needs. However, how they utilized these techniques and the particular ingredients that were available led to the development of regional or national cuisines based around the same core principles of preserving life by preserving food. Climate, in particular, strongly influenced the use of one technique or ingredient over another and the material developments necessary to prevent food waste in that particular area. The sun-drying traditions seen throughout northern Africa and the Mediterranean were obviously far more difficult to employ in wetter English weather, necessitating the building of specific drying or smoking houses and an increased reliance on preservation methods like wet brining and pickling. In colonial America, seasonal variations between northern and southern locales saw significant differences in the motivation for putting up food. Shorter southern winters meant a longer growing season and therefore less pressure to preserve foods for the long winter months compared to places like Maine or the Midwest. But an increased intensity of need for preservation at harvest time as warmer temperatures and humidity sped up the process of decay. Preservation enthusiast and former director of African American research at Monticello, Lenny Sorensen, puts it very simply. She said, when it comes to preservation, it has as much to do with how long you're preserving food as to what context you live in. Now, before the advent of readily available prepackaged foods and widespread introduction of grocery stores, skills in the preservation of food were essential to survival and arguably the most important part of one's domestic economy, being able to conserve, preserve, store foods, vegetables, fruits, and meats from a period of harvest or slaughter through a period of scarcity. A rudimentary understanding was likely part of the basic domestic training for all members of society, but became increasingly tied to the domestic work expectations of women and enslaved people throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, which offers an important opportunity to better understand the everyday lives of those who are most often forgotten or overlooked in the historical record. Frequently, however, these preservation techniques were taught orally or passed on through experiential training, which leaves little material evidence behind. So the documentary record therefore provides an important window into the realm of foodways and preservation research. In addition to oral traditions, other informal means of information transmission include diaries and manuscript recipe books, like the one this pickle recipe came from. Probate inventories and newspapers offer insight into the material terminology of different time periods and the types of goods available for public consumption. Published cookery books are another important resource for the food historian, shedding light on the available ingredients and preferred culinary techniques of a particular era. We'll talk about those for just a second. Starting in the 18th century, cookery books were increasingly targeted towards the burgeoning middle class, and many began to include extensive sections of recipes on preserving or keeping food safe, which indicates that food preservation was still an essential survival activity and a central tenet of household management. Indeed, between the years 1700 and 1800, over 300 titles on food and cookery alone were published, many of these going into several subsequent editions and being published in both Britain and colonial America. In both of these areas, the intended audience for these cookery books were housekeepers or innkeepers who are working as individuals, or gentlewomen with a small team of servants, which directly reflects the growing change in the social structure of the middle-class domestic household. This period saw all responsibility for the domestic aspects of household management gradually placed onto the individual housewife, who, it should be noted, would, depending on class, obviously had enslaved people or other servants to assist her. In terms of the variety of preservation techniques and the dramatic variation in ingredient availability, the height of food preservation culture therefore coincided with the rise of the idea of the frugal housewife and the expectation of a home effortlessly managed with economy and without waste, which was a concept strongly encouraged by the massive expansion in the literary and print market targeted at 18th century middle-class women. The recipes and recommendations contained in their pages provide hints to the lived experience and the material world of preservation that these women encounter daily. Many of the most common preserving methods have been with us since the beginning of history, all attempting to create an environment that's inhospitable to harmful microorganisms such as molds, yeast, and bacteria. The specific material goods developed to aid this process are often utilitarian, multi-purpose, and designed for functionality first over aesthetics or decorative flair. They facilitated daily life by making it easier to process, store, and serve food and beverages, continuously used until worn out, broken, or repurposed for another task. Studying their use reveals how communities adapted to new materials or ingredients, and how influential these foods-keeping principles are even today. Now, in setting this up, there's no way to cover every method of food preservation in one presentation. So instead, I am merely going to introduce the core preserving traditions that I mentioned previously: drying, smoking, salting, potting, vinegar pickling, and sugaring or candying. And I've organized this talk to examine these techniques in descending order of importance to the majority and in ascending cost to complete. And you will notice that fermentation is not on this list. While an important preservation technique, fermentation depends on the development of microorganisms rather than efforts to prevent their growth, and therefore don't fit into the scale very well. Additionally, the range of methods and materials for fermentation really need a presentation all of their own, so I can look for the future at some point. But we still have plenty to bite into today, so let's get started. Our first technique is drying. Drying is the oldest and simplest preservation method. Air drying or sun drying can be applied to almost all manner of foods, including animal flesh, vegetation, and perhaps most importantly, grains. Grains are one of the most commonly overlooked aspects of food preservation because we so infrequently encounter them in their raw form today. But some type of wheat, rice, oats, or other cereal grains form the basis of nearly all world cuisines, providing important carbohydrate fuels, numerous vitamins, and often the bulk of daily consumption. Dried grains were often kept in large underground storage pits or purpose-built storage houses called granaries. And to combat the wetter climate in Britain, these granaries were small, one-room storage buildings set upon mushroom-shaped saddle stones, which you can actually see at both of the bases of the buildings here. Typically 2 to 3 feet in height, these stones lifted granaries off the ground, protecting their stored grain from groundwater seepage and vermin, which could not climb up and then around the tall rounded stones. Saddle stones themselves are used less frequently in America, but granaries were still built with a raised stone foundation to allow for increased air circulation and to protect from the same type of vermin. Modern storage silos actually follow this same principle of eliminating moisture and sustaining a dry, secure environment. Without exposure to some type of dampness, fully dried grains can last for years without spoiling. And they can also be ground or stored as flour in barrels and large sacks for transport and later sale. One of the most widely recognizable forms of preserving grains for later use is hardtack, or the ship's biscuit, that are used for long seafaring voyages. Containing neither fats nor moisture, these travel staples lasted for significant periods of time, as evidenced in this description from the 1773 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which reads, "Sea biscuit is a sort of bread, much dried by passing the oven twice to make it keep for sea service. For long voyages, they bake it 4 times and prepare it 6 months before embarkation. It will hold good for a whole year." The biscuit pictured on the left actually dates from 1784, proving that they can in fact survive far longer than a single year. Oven drying became particularly important for areas where weather conditions did not support air drying alone. In Britain and colonial America, bake ovens were often repurposed at the end of the day as warm, dry places to speed the process of air drying. These areas also saw the construction of separate drying houses or barns built with slatted walls to facilitate airflow and protect from rainfall and other dangerous elements. Tobacco barns and corn cribs, which like the one pictured on the right here, are just a few examples of the more specialized forms such as drying outbuildings and barns. However, because of their consistent reuse and utilitarian nature, far fewer of these structures obviously exist today than would have been used throughout their lifetime. Underground cellars served a similar protective function. At Stenton House in Philadelphia, archaeological research in their underground cellar revealed a number of wooden storage shelves and a series of wrought iron hooks stuck into wooden ceiling joists. Believed to have been used as a meat cellar, these hooks could have held large cuts of beef or pork, either dried, salted, or smoked. Hanging would have facilitated increased airflow and would have kept such foods out of reach of rodents. Stanton's researchers also uncovered a large wrought iron J-shaped hook, which was nearly 4 feet in length, and it probably would have been used to assist in hanging and removing each preserved cut of meat from these high-up hooks. Underground storage cellars like this could be found in houses across America, and similar wrought iron hooks or nails were frequently used for hanging food for drying in kitchens and pantries as well. Now, one of the main strengths of dried food is their versatility. They can be consumed dry or reconstituted with water and then cooked. Dried meat and fish are actually more nutritionally dense than their fresh counterparts because their nutrients become more concentrated pound for pound when moisture is removed. This is especially helpful for military use or periods of extended travel and exploration when large amounts of protein are required. The sugars in fruit also become dramatically concentrated when dried, making drying a sweet alternative to more expensive options like candy cane. Most fruits were dried in a similar manner to meats and fish. Small fruits like grapes, cherries, or currants were laid out in a warm oven or in the sun to dry whole, while larger fruits like apples, pears, apricots, or melons were cut and hung on strings to dry in pieces to speed the drying process. Nuts and herbs were also similarly air dried for future use. After thoroughly drying, these items could then be placed in wooden boxes or casks for safekeeping, but they were rarely kept for the same length of time as dried meats or grains. Vegetable drying, on the other hand, was practiced less frequently. Instead, many families simply buried large caches of root vegetables in the ground or covered them with straw and sand for the winter in their underground cellars. Drying fruits in particular could be fairly difficult as their high moisture and sugar content meant many pieces would rot before they became completely dry, and therefore it needed the added help of a drying oven or close proximity to a fire. And with fire comes smoke, which brings us to our next preservation technique. Attempting to speed the drying process with the heat from a nearby fire is likely how early peoples first discovered the technique of smoking foods. The official origin date of smoking as a preservation method is unknown, but its history is closely tied with the development of worldwide drying traditions. The added heat and drying action of smoke helps to preserve food and hasten the preservation process. However, key to smoking is the introduction of formaldehyde and certain alcohols chemically produced by the burning wood, which act as a natural preservative. Smoking is therefore not just drying out your food, it also changes the flavor as the smoke imbues food with new chemical substances. And though known to colonists prior to their arrival in America, exposure to the prevalent use of smoking as a means of preserving fish and meat by American Indians increased colonial reliance on this technique in particular, which was also very helpful for the humid weather that they encountered upon first arrival. There are actually 2 methods of smoking food, cold smoking and hot smoking. Cold smoking uses a smoking temperature of less than 85 degrees Fahrenheit and was employed less frequently or really more often combined with another preservation method like fermenting and salting. It produced a much milder smoke flavor and foods are not fully cooked, which means they don't keep for nearly as long. Hot smoking was the more common way to smoke foods and requires a smoking temperature of over 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Meats become partially cooked from their long exposure to heat and smoke, and their flesh develops a hardened surface, often darkens to a reddish-brown color, and takes on a much stronger smoke flavor. This method allows meats and fish to be kept for significantly longer periods of time, and is generally what we think about when we think of smoked meats. Smokehouses are a direct material development of the need for large-scale smoking efforts in climates that did not widely support air drying, and are another type of structure fully dedicated to food preservation that still survive today. Compared to the slatted walls of drying barns, you can see that their solid construction facilitated a long, slow exposure to smoke from a low fire, which eliminates moisture gradually and allows the necessary chemicals to develop and then protect the flesh. Key to either smoking method, however, is the need for hardwood fuel for the fire. Soft woods like pine or spruce contain pitch, which can produce a film on the outside of foods from the smoke and impart a bitter rather than smoky flavor. Significant portions of our contemporary barbecue traditions still rely on this foundational idea of using smoke as an actual ingredient in flavoring meat. Although I have to say, as a material culturalist, the idea of using smoke as an object is incredibly frustrating. But the smoking process that was done in these houses could take anywhere from a few hours to up to a few days, depending on the moisture content and the type of food being preserved and the desired level of preservation. While meat, fowl, and fish were the most commonly smoked foods, many cheeses, nuts, and occasionally produce were also smoked to extend their life. Similar to dried foods, smoked meats were often hung for long-term storage, like these hams, and could easily have been a part of the foodstuffs put up at Spin on their underground cellar hooks, or the nearly identical hooks found at the Randolph Mitchell House in New Reading, Ohio, which is on the right. Another option following smoking was to simply wrap food in paper or cloth and store it in barrels. In many homes, ham and bacon were sewn into muslin or porcelain bags and then lime washed for further safekeeping. Other times they were buried in fine, clean wood ash in a chest barrel rocks and kept underneath sand, which further aided in keeping out the air. There could also be an obvious considerable overlap in these preservation methods. For example, curing foods like bacon often combines smoking with salting, which is our next preservation technique. Salt, like heat and smoke, sped the drying process and helped to inhibit bacterial growth as moisture was pulled out of the food through osmosis. The process of salting meat has existed since the Iron Age, but actually saw a lot of increased use in Britain and Europe with the start of the Little Ice Age in the 16th century. This was a period of drastic climate change which marked a key transition for Western food preservation. The colder, wetter temperatures forced an increased reliance on salting and potting, two techniques focused on excluding air rather than relying on it for drying purposes, and they also did not require heat for preservation. The 17th and 18th centuries saw direct expansion in the material goods available to aid in the salting process, such as salt boxes, a late example of which is shown here on the left from the Winterthur collection. Dried meats and fish were gradually relegated to the fodder of the lower classes, the military, or consumed only under the necessity of travel, while salted foods reigned in popularity instead. Now, like smoking, there are two types of salting techniques, both of which saw consistent and widespread use throughout colonial America and Great Britain. With dry salting, food is repeatedly rubbed with coarse dry salt. As the salt is absorbed, moisture is forced out until the food is partially dried and a hardened, protective exterior crust is formed. Occasionally, sugar and spices were mixed into this coating as well, but the simplest and cheapest option was, of course, to just use salt alone. Food was then buried in a container or barrel with more dry salt, or more typically hung to dry. Coarse, large-grained salt was recommended for dry salting because it did not melt into the moist flesh as quickly and therefore would not cure or harden the exterior of the meat before the salt was able to fully penetrate the meat in its entirety. And a careful eye was needed to routinely check on salted foods and add more layers of this salt as they absorbed in until that even, hardened exterior crust was formed. Still, this method only actually inhibited bacterial growth on or near the surface of the food and was only effective in short-term preserving. Wet salting, on the other hand, had considerable longer applications. And as the name wet salting might suggest, foods were not hung to dry, but were submerged in a saline bath following an initial coating of dry salt. This process was also called brining, sousing, corning, or pickling, although it should be noted that salt-brined meats are different from the type of vinegar-soaked pickles that we will discuss later. Many of these culinary terms are used interchangeably throughout time, and so I'll try to carefully differentiate the medium that's actually being used to do the pickling when that word comes up. For foods preserved through salt brining, they could be kept good for years, but protection from the air was paramount to success. Large wooden or stone weights were often used to ensure all of the food remained under the liquid salt solution during the salting process. This procedure is laid out very clearly in Lydia Maria Child's recipe for salted fat pork in The American Frugal Housewife. She writes, "Pack your pork down in tight layers, salt every layer. When the brine is cool, cover the pork with it, and keep a heavy stone on top to keep the pork under brine. Look to it once in a while for the first few weeks, and if the salt is all melted, throw in more. This brine, scalding and skimmed every time it is used, will continue good 20 years. Starting in the 17th century, a growing consumer market for ceramics saw a wide array of utilitarian earthenware pans and bowls produced for kitchen use in a wide range of sizes. These were especially helpful for the initial step of salting, which let meats release excess moisture before being packed into their larger barrels or tubs for the long brining process. Earthenware pans were often round or ovoid in shape with slanted or vertical sides like the two examples in the middle here, and their glazed interior prevented meat juices from escaping about the kitchen. Large metal or wooden tubs were widely available for kitchen use and were frequently used for this salting step as well. Hannah Glass offers her particular preference in her book, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy. In her recipe to make pork hams, she writes, "A deep hollow wooden tray is better than a pan because the pickle swells about it." A large cut of meat like a ham can give off a considerable amount of liquid, and she obviously felt that a deeper container was better suited for the task at hand than shallower pans or bowls. Hams were a luxury product compared to other types of salted pork because of the large cut of meat and the amount of salt and other preservatives needed to take care of them. Bacon and brined pork, which used less desirable cuts of meat, were far more economical options. The brining process left these meats extremely tender and soft, and most had to be rinsed before being consumed to remove some of the excess salt. This type of meat was frequently used to flavor soups and stews and is still popular in many parts of the American South especially. Pickled pork was even recently featured on Vivian Howard's popular PBS TV show, A Chef's Life. I just recommend going and checking out that episode. Pork hams were also not the only type of ham that could be salted or brined. Beef hams and goat hams were also produced following the same salting methods, with salt beef being a widely used foodstuff on board ships and taverns. Fish as well could be dry or wet salted. Herring, cod, mackerel, sardines, and anchovies were very familiar to colonial American consumers and those in Great Britain, but they were more often commercially produced and processed and preserved at home in large numbers. While fruits and vegetables were more regularly pickled with vinegar, there is also evidence of occasional produce brining with salt. Hannah Glass and Mary Randolph and Elizabeth Ellicott Lee all include recipes in their cookery books for salting French, green, or lima beans using the same type of salt brine. Ultimately, the near universal use of salt in food preservation meant that this commodity was at a constant risk of heavy tax exploitation. Growing salt and spice taxes were key factors in the decline of some salt-preserved foods. Many cookery books recommended the use of saltpeter or salmonella, nitrogen-based preservatives, to help with preservation and avoid such high quantities of salt, and they were also helped to keep a bright pink color to the meat. But these chemical additives could be poisonous at high doses and never reach the same commercial success as just salt itself. Therefore, while salted foods were still widely consumed, the 17th and 18th century also saw a dramatic rise in the popularity and production of potted foods and vinegar-pickled foods, driven especially by the same expansion in the ceramics and stoneware market. So these are our next two techniques to explore. Potting and pickling both require a large quantity of some sort of preservation substrate, either lard or butter, to seal potted foods or acidic pickling vinegar. The material costs of each technique can vary widely based on the ingredients used, types of containers that you can purchase for long-term storage. However, potting could be done in a wider range of vessels and will therefore be discussed next. This technique returns to the basic premise that prepared foods or ingredients can remain in good condition if they are, as the recipes say, excluded from air. Ceramics specifically designed for food preservation started to be developed in mass in the 15th century, and by 1569, the term potting came to refer to the process of sealing food in airtight ceramic containers with some sort of fat. However, it was not until the dramatic expansion of the retail market for affordable ceramic wares in the 17th century that potting in clay vessels was widely adopted as a food preservation method by all classes. And these ceramic forms were actually a mere evolution of earlier pastry traditions. Prior to the widespread availability of pottery containers, pastry or pie dough actually served the exact same function. Thick, hearty crusts of rye or wheat flours were used to encase meats, fish, or other filling before being baked hard. Vent holes in the top of these pastry cases allowed butter or melted fat to be poured in after baking. Once cooled, this fat formed a solid protective layer around the filling, preventing air from reaching the pie's interior. Such pastry containers could then be transported, stored for long periods of time. Sometimes they were even referred to as coffins for their box-like quality. You could open up. Their thick walls were not meant to be intentionally eaten, only serving as functional barriers to exterior contaminants. Spoons, or even just fingers, like my favorite background character from Jan Steen's The Fat Kitchen, who you see scooping out the pie's interior, were used to consume the interior of these pastries once the lid was cracked open. Potting in actual pots took over in the 16 and 1700s, although many foods were still baked with a protective pastry layer over the top to prevent burning. Removed after baking, the pot or dish was then cooled completely, and a thick layer of fat was added over the top to seal out air and keep airborne contaminants from entering the pot's contents. Cookery books offer generous recommendations for this skin of fat that would be across the top. One mid-17th century recipe called for butter 3 fingers breadth thick. And here, Hannah Glass again offers important advice to the home cook, saying, "Let your butter be good, or you will spoil all," as rancid butter pretty much meant the end for anything contained in a pot. While butter was most commonly used for this task, lard and mutton fat were also employed to smother a pot's contents. And most potting pots were rounded vessels with vertical walls, although they can occasionally be found in more creatively shaped forms, like the heart-shaped example on the right. I like to think of these as the casserole dish of the 1700s, if you will. They came in a whole range of materials, decorative patterns, and sizes. Pots for potting fish were sometimes called jar pots, after the type of fish cooked inside frequently, and were often much shallower compared to pots for meat. Occasionally, cooked fillings were transferred to utilitarian storage jars before being sealed with a layer of fat, if the baking dish that they were using wasn't the type of dish that they wanted. These baking and storage items were important import commodities for American colonists until the disruption of the American Revolution. By that time, creamware and stoneware options had begun to take over their earthenware counterparts in popularity, and many American stoneware potters stepped up the domestic production of utilitarian kitchenwares to fill this wartime gap, which developed into an important 19th century industry. Cooks quickly realized that diced or chopped or blended fillings worked best with this technique to form a more smooth, solid barrier against air contaminants rather than having your whole roast chicken with the legs sticking out and you have to cover all of that in butter. Meats, fish, and other fillings were often cooked, diced up, mixed with butter, and then pressed into their ceramic containers for sealing under a thick coat of fat. Like many 18th century cookery books, Charles Carter's 1730 recipe book, The Complete Practical Cook, contains an entire section titled How to Pot Flesh, Fish, or Fowl. One of his most descriptive recipes for potted venison reads, "Then put it into little glazed pots, round or oval, place it in rows, fat and lean, putting in little bits to fill the chinks, press it down well, and leave room on top for an inch of clarified butter. Write on them and tie them up close and keep them for your use." Other recipes of his include more material hints at the type of pots recommended for this task, which include references to handsome glazed pots, fine oval pots, and such pots as are wider at the top than the bottom, which is an example of how these recipe books can be really great hints at some of the material world that exists, even if they don't survive today. While butter sealed the pot's contents, paper or a leather cover was also frequently tied over top of the container around the rounded rim, and is likely what Carter was referring to in his recipe when he says tie them up close. Cooked meats and fish preserved in this manner were the most commonly potted items, although recipes for potting vegetables and other cooked fillings do exist in smaller numbers. Potted meats were especially popular with inns and taverns to serve on a cold board, cut into very thin slices, and then served with vinegar or pickles. Potting was also a useful method for keeping large amounts of more specialty items like giblets or coxcombs that were only used in small quantities but were harder to source at the last minute. If sealed close from the air, recipes claimed potted foods could keep for months to up to a few years if stored in a cool, dry place that allowed their thick covering of butter to remain intact, although many were likely consumed with relative speed and then routinely replaced. Often served alongside these potted meats are the vinegar pickled foods, which are one of the most recognizable forms of historic food keeping. Following on the heels of potting, pickling rose to prominence with the expansion of the ceramics market and the growing culture of tavern and innkeeping. However, unique to this approach is the need for stoneware jars or containers. Vinegar's strong acidic nature meant that it created an environment in which few bacteria could survive, but it also means that lead from the glazes on earthenware vessels can be dangerously leached into a jar's contents, which would then obviously poison your food, which is not a good thing. Neither the butter used in potting nor salt in brining has the same destructive effects and could therefore be completed in any type of vessel. On August 15, 1798, a New York City resident wrote of his experience with this earthenware problem in a poignant letter to the editor of the Continental Advertiser newspaper. He opens, "A necessary caution respecting the use of brown glazed earthen vessels. From the following circumstance, it is very evident that this ware, either from it not being baked sufficiently hard, or from some composition in the coloring, is capable of communicating a nauseous, poisonous quality." His letter is very long, and it goes on to explain how he and his wife have been consuming brandy and sherry wine from an earthenware vessel for a number of weeks, and goes on to describe what it looked like. But during that time, he goes on to say that they have been afflicted without ever suspecting the cause, with considerable degree of weakness, irregular state of the body, frequent vomitings, and an aversion to food, with an almost continual disagreeable bitter taste in the mouth. Simply signed W, this letter illustrates the potential dangers of using earthenware vessels with strong pickling agents. Vinegar is created when an alcoholic brew made from grapes, potatoes, fruits, or some sort of grain is exposed to the air, and a bacterial reaction turns the alcohol into acetic acid. So the alcohols in the brandy and sherry wine in W's story contain the same glaze stripping properties as vinegar, which allow lead to leach into the beverages and slowly start to What this W needed instead was stoneware. In contrast to earthenware, it's fired at a considerably higher temperature, which literally melts the minerals in the clay to form a non-porous ceramic body. This makes stoneware an ideal material for food preservation because it's impervious to liquids, it resists staining, and is also highly insulated. While stoneware could be used unglazed, most British and American stoneware potters glaze their pieces by adding salt to the kiln during the second, shorter firing. Upon being heated, this salt vaporizes, which leaves a glossy layer of sodium silicate on the exterior of the object. In this way, stoneware became the most versatile ceramic body, as it could store any ingredient without the danger of lead poisoning, and was subsequently fashioned into all manner of household items, including the jugs, jars, and crocks traditionally used in vinegar pickling. The growth of the tavern business throughout colonial America prompted huge demand for such stoneware items, both imported and locally made, to support the growing consumption of pickled and potted foods, as well as beer and other alcohols. Stoneware containers for pickling came in all number of forms. The most recognizable, though, are the ovoid and cylindrical wide-mouthed jars, which were made in sizes from 1/2 gallon up to some giant 30 gallons and over that a small child can set down in. Although there is considerable variation in the details of their individual shape, a wide mouth is necessary for easily inserting and removing pieces of food and was usually of about equal circumference to the base. Stoneware jugs were also necessary for transporting and storing the large amounts of vinegar and alcohol needed to create cold foods. Similarly, ovoid or cylindrical in shape, these jugs had a much smaller mouth or raised spout to aid in pouring and often featured a strap handle on one side as well. Now, great pains were taken to make sure that these pickle jars were kept as airtight as possible. They could be covered with a paper cover, a bladder, waxed cloth, or a fitted leather cover tied tightly around the rolled or rounded jar rims, as exampled in this tiny detail here. Inexpensive turned discs of wood were also frequently used as coverings or as weights to keep food submerged before being tied closed. And in rarer occurrences, jars were made with matching stoneware lids that would rest on a small flat rim, like this example from the Winter collection. Now, wine vinegar was the preferred and most recommended pickling agent, but all kinds of vinegar could be used and were often influenced by the area of production and created in regional delicacies. Cider vinegar, for example, became particularly popular in apple growing regions in America and in England. Alternative vinegars were also available. Bear juice is a milder pickling substance made from unripe grapes or apples, and alegar was the product of sour ale or malt, which became particularly popular in Britain. Parallel to the range of possibilities for producing vinegar, all manner of foods could be pickled, although fruits, vegetables, and nuts are still the most common. Pickled walnuts, in particular, are a surprisingly popular mainstay of cookery books throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Pickled peaches, tomatoes, cucumbers, of course, and eggs also make frequent appearances. Many cookery books called for adding spices like mustard, garlic, or ginger to the pickling liquid to create an even more flavorful mix. Such pickled foods were eaten as side dishes and often embellished with chopped herbs or spiced breadcrumbs on the dinner table. They could also be used to add flavor to soups or stews. Some went on to become the garnishes for meat dishes or were used with extra pickling liquid to create flavorful sauces, which soon led to the development of condiments like ketchup and relish, both of which were produced commercially in the 1760s, starting in the 1760s, and were intensely popular in the tavern and pub setting. So it was not until World War II that we actually start seeing the term pickle itself come to imply vinegar pickled cucumbers specifically. While fresh meats are more likely to be potted or salted, as we've seen previously, some collared meats, which were a cut of meat that would be rolled very tightly and then cooked, would then subsequently be submersed in vinegar to create a different flavor profile for the finished product. Often labeled vinegar soused meats, these were typically served cold at dinner. Comparatively, there was a much wider tradition of pickling fish, especially herring and mackerel, which became a specialty throughout Northern Europe, often using a combination of oil and spices to create regional specialties. The pickling process could take a few weeks to a couple of months, depending on the type of food being pickled and the level of pickle that you wanted. Like salted meats, the longer food is left in a vinegar brine, the softer it becomes. So if a crunchier pickle is desired, foods can simply be removed from the vinegar solution after a couple of days, rinsed and then consumed, or returned to a much weaker vinegar solution for more long-term storage. Although many cookery books include references to using glass bottles, these remained outside the reach of most middle-class consumers until the 19th century. Expensive glass jars and bottles simply couldn't compete with cheaply made ceramics. The introduction of multi-part molds to the glass blowing industry signaled the end for stoneware containers as glassware became significantly cheaper for the average consumer. By the late 19th century, glass jars and bottles completely took over the commercial market for pickle and preserve making, with many companies like the Marion Flint Glass Company, whose letterhead is pictured here, producing wares just for this new industry. You'll actually notice that the center says pickleware on the little banner, because they made jars and bottles just for the pickle industry. The advent of canning was the final blow to the widespread use of stoneware containers. For many, it simply became far more affordable to purchase prepackaged, preserved foods than to continue making this process at home. But speaking of affordability, we will just briefly explore sugaring and candying. In terms of cost, this technique was the pinnacle of food preservation methods. Fruits, nuts, and exotic spices were coated in cane sugar, honey, or molasses to protect them from the air. Honey had been used as a preservative since ancient times, used by the Egyptians, Romans, and many groups of indigenous Americans. Like salt, sugar contains antiseptic properties and creates an environment where no living organism can grow. In fact, any food that is over 65% sugar will be resistant to spoilage, which I think is the whole thing behind Twinkies and why they'll never spoil, in addition to all of the artificial things. But as most fruits and vegetables contain varying degrees of natural sugar, often they can be preserved simply by adding more sugar until reaching a sugar content over that 65% threshold. To achieve this, fruits can either be preserved whole by being soaked in a sugar syrup before being coated in a dry sugar coating or in honey, which would harden, which creates candied fruits. Or fruits could be chopped down and then cooked with added sugars to make marmalades and preserves. Nuts, spices, and even expensive cuts of meat like ham were also coated in sugar or honey for safekeeping, which is where we eventually developed our honey-baked ham traditions. Throughout most of history, the use of preserved fruits was rare except by the upper classes. The 18th century saw the rise of the Caribbean sugar trade, which caused dramatic growth in the consumption of sugar by all classes, where it was increasingly used to sweeten tea, coffee, and desserts. Many recipes that traditionally called for honey were easily adapted and rewritten to include cane sugar instead. While this made candying or preserving whole foods and fruits and sugar more accessible to the middle classes, it was still practiced significantly less frequently than any other preservation techniques such as salting and pickling, because salt, vinegar, and butter just simply remained more affordable options. Spiced sweetmeats and confectionery practices were still seen as symbols of luxury and celebration, often saved for holidays or special occasions. But what did see a significant rise in production were the jams, jellies, and marmalades that soon turned into a thriving commercial industry across Britain and in many parts of America. The late 19th century saw the most rapid expansion in the use of sugar for preserving and the rise of mass-produced glass bottles and jars. And the growing number of trade publications became dedicated specifically to candy making and confectionery arts. And of course, we have today where sugar is just everywhere. Now, combined, each of these techniques, drying, smoking, salting, potting, pickling, and candying, serve to enrich and preserve human life. That's not to say, however, that they were always successful. Drying fruits were especially susceptible to mold, and spoiled meat caused many a sickness, and despite the warnings, lead-glazed earthenwares were still used with vinegar or alcohol to the detriment of their drinkers. Food spoilage was a common and expected part of life. As such, cookery book authors also strove to include advice for when things went a little bit awry. Hannah Glass made sure that her work contained recipes for how to save potted birds that begin to be bad, as well as how to keep venison or hares sweet or make them fresh when they stink. For thousands of years, people have adapted these same culinary traditions in their material world to sustain a healthy, usually delicious, communal existence. The further we move away from the fear of famine and starvation, the more specialized and luxurious the application of these food preservation techniques can be. Today, when faced with particular food shortages, we can simply import something to meet consumer demands. Most of the legwork has been taken out of keeping our food fresh. Canned foods keep produce suspended in time, and the frozen section of our grocery stores grow ever larger with more and more foods designed to survive essentially indefinitely. This is an extremely sharp departure from the centuries-old reliance on food preservation techniques necessary to stave off danger, scarcity, and starvation. So the next time you savor your applewood smoked bacon, top a hot dog with pickles or ketchup, or spread strawberry jelly on your breakfast toast, I hope that you consider the small taste of food history you are consuming every bite. Thank you.